This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Weisbuch, one of the founders of Medical Professionals for 9/11 Truth. We're going to be talking about the after effects of the 9/11 event itself in New York City, particularly because Craig McKee, he was our guest last week on the show. He's one of the great writers at AE 9/11 Truth. Has a new article up. It is titled, How 9/11 Continues to Kill. I'm looking at it right now in front of me, and this details the terrible health effects of people who were on the scene there, first responders, not even just first responders, but people who just lived in the area around where the attacks took place. I mean, suffering cancers, other illnesses as a result of that day. And let's not forget that it's not just because airplanes crashed into the buildings. Somebody made a conscious decision to bring those buildings down in controlled demolitions. That means that our issue that we champion, even after all of this time, because you hear this, you talk to people about 9/11, and once they give up on trying to fight you on the facts because they realize that our facts are solid, the evidence is good enough to warrant a new investigation, to open the whole matter up again, then they go to excuses. They say, hey, that was 16 years ago. You know, I'm sorry that those people died that day, but we're here now. We got to look to the future. People who are alive now, we have to live the world for them, make the world a better place for them. Let's not dwell on what happened or didn't happen on September 11th. We got to look to the future. Well, there's people who are alive now, but they're slowly dying, and it's as a result of what happened on that day. So for those people, whether they know about the controlled demolition evidence or not, our issue is relevant as it was immediately after 9/11. They deserve to know why they're sick. Now, I got some excerpts from Craig's article, and you're going to hear other excerpts tonight in the interview with Dr. Weisbuch, but I wanted to make sure that these excerpts stood out here at the beginning of the program tonight. But the first one says this: while the U.S. government and the corporate-controlled mainstream media would have us believe that the deaths and illnesses from Ground Zero are the result of the impact of two Boeing 767 airliners on and resulting fires in the Twin Towers, the abundance of forensic evidence compiled by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and other researchers demonstrates that the official version of events cannot be true. As we know, WTC-7, which fell in the late afternoon of 9/11, was not hit by an airplane. This physical evidence clearly shows that the three World Trade Center towers were deliberately demolished using explosives that had to have been placed in the buildings prior to that day. So we can't just let the people who have covered up this massive crime off the hook. 9/11 is continuing to kill people. For people who are sick right now, 9/11 is happening every single day. Right? They're victims of this crime just as much as the people who actually died inside the buildings. And that's actually highlighted in the second quote that I pulled out from the article by Craig McKee. It says, those who suffer from cancer and other illnesses as a result of 9/11 are the victims of a deliberate decision to demolish the buildings, which turned the towers into the toxic dust that invaded their bodies. For them, 9/11 isn't an event that happened more than 15 years ago. For them, it's still happening, still killing. The dual need to educate the public about what destroyed the three towers and to obtain a new investigation is as relevant and essential today as it was in the years immediately following 9/11. So I want to stress this. I want to bring it home to our audience. A lot of our audience is activists who are out there doing whatever they can to spread the word about this important issue. Drive this home when you're speaking to others about the evidence, when they start to pull that trick on you, and you might have a point, but why even bother to look back at it? I mean, come on, that's the past. We're in the present, looking to the future. Well, so are the people that are sick. So are the people who have cancer and other illnesses as a result of 9/11. And they don't know how much of a future they're looking into at this point. Terribly tragic, terribly horrible thing that was done to them. So we're going to continue the fight and keep on spreading awareness of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence for them, just as much as for the people who died in the actual event that day when the buildings were brought down in controlled demolitions, because they're as much victims as anyone else too. All right, I'm going to play that interview for you in just a moment. Stay tuned.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Last week, our writer Craig McKee published his latest article at ae911truth.org titled How 9/11 Continues to Kill, about illnesses resulting because of the demolitions of the towers in New York on September 11th. One of the people mentioned in that article is my guest today, Dr. Jonathan Weisbuch, a founding member of Medical Professionals for 9/11 Truth. Doctor, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Andy, and I hope I can help out with your discussion.
So you were on a few years ago to talk about your organization, Medical Professionals for 9/11 Truth, but it's been a long time. We have new listeners, so please tell us about your background.
All right. Well, I got interested in this issue several years ago after watching the towers fall, and I said to myself, something's wrong there. I can see something's not right. The reason I felt that way is my original background in college was as a civil engineer, and I remember studying structures and reading about how buildings were built and so on and so forth. And when I watched those buildings fall, it just didn't make sense. And then at some later point, I heard Gage speak, and it became clear that there was something screwy going on. I read the 9/11 report, and then I read David Griffin's books, some of his early books on that thing, and I began to realize that things were not right. But what really caught me was that people began to report not only the deaths from the destruction of the towers and the airplanes, but that there were people who had worked at Ground Zero and who had worked in that area of Lower Manhattan, and they were beginning to come down with a multitude of miscellaneous illnesses. It occurred to me, and after medical school, I went and I was drafted in the Navy, and I spent 2 years on a nuclear submarine, where the issue of air pollution was a very important one. And so when I finally came out of the Navy in 68 or 66, I applied to the School of Public Health at Harvard and became a public health professional. And most of the work that I've done in that field, and as the health officer, for example, in North Dakota, where air pollution, water pollution, and other forms of pollution were very important at the time, I worked for a very interesting guy who was one of the heroes, I think, of the 20th century, a fellow by the name of Arthur A. Link, who was the governor, who wanted to preserve the environment. And so I became very sophisticated or very knowledgeable about how the environment had an impact on health. And so after I spent time there, and then was later in Wyoming in the same capacity, and then in Los Angeles, where I was a medical director for the Department of Health Services, where again problems of air pollution and water pollution, particularly the issues of smog and dust pollution and so on, all became very important. Then I took my final job, which was in Maricopa County, Arizona, where again environmental pollution issues were critical. We would have many times when the particulate matter in the air and the smog that was developed as a result of the heat and the traffic and so on would result in illness. So the 9/11 situation, when people began to express disease and pulmonary problems, I said to myself, this is something's going on here. I was concerned, and I think Mr. McKee, who just published that article you've mentioned the fact that the quality of the environment in Lower Manhattan after the event was clearly not what the Environmental Protection Agency was alleged to have published in saying it was all right to go down there and go back to work and so on and so forth. There were two things that really troubled me. One, when you saw the event on television and you saw the clouds and then you saw stories of the dust that laid on everything and up to a quarter of an inch or whatever it was, it occurred to me that is not a healthy environment, and how the EPA could have said that, I was just, I didn't believe it. Then, knowing what I learned in my residency about miners and black lung disease, I said to myself, wait a minute, they've blown up a whole bunch of concrete and small particles, at the 2.5 micron level of size, which can get into the lung and then cause the lung to have the same kind of problems that miners with black lung disease can have. And sure enough, that's what we've been finding in the results that have been published by the health authorities in New York, who are seeing hundreds of cases a week and tens of cases a week, and certainly thousands of cases who have died, or 1,100 or 1,200 cases who have died from lung disease of a variety of different kinds. So that's where I've been coming from, and that's when I said, this event has caused more deaths than just the couple of hundred people who died on the airplanes, certainly more deaths than the 3,000 people who died in the crash, and certainly a lot of deaths from the people who then were sent to fight Iraq for reasons that were not clear, and the thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who died, so that this event had an impact on tens of thousands, if not maybe hundreds of thousands, and maybe even millions of people who were exposed to this event or the outcome of this event in one way or another. Reports of illness coming out of those who were exposed to the ground zero effect and to people who lived in that area, it occurred to me that we needed to develop a 9/11 truth for medical health workers, and we did that. And Stephen Jonas and others, Dr. Jones, many others have been part of that, because they too, I think, realize that this event has been has caused a health destruction in ways that were not even contemplated when the event occurred.
It is so important, the points that you raise, and I've been bringing this up for quite a few months now. But so often, when we do outreach, when we talk to people, for instance, delegates at the AIA, we just had a vote taken there on whether or not they would essentially call for a new investigation into World Trade Center 7. And we talked to delegates who did not vote in favor of it, and one of the things they would say was that, oh, it's in the past, let's put it behind us. So, who cares about what happened 15, 16 years ago? And this is a typical reaction we get from many people who just don't want to deal with the issue. They say, it's in the past, we got to look forward. It's sad that those people died that day, but, they're gone now and the future is upon us. Well, not everybody who is going to die as a result of 9/11 has died on that day. And as Craig McKee's article is titled, 9/11 continues to kill. They're experiencing 9/11. The people who have gotten sick as a result of September 11th and the demolitions of these buildings are continuing to suffer. And as I just hinted at a moment ago, they aren't sick because airplanes ran into buildings, right? They're sick because somebody made a conscious decision to bring those buildings down and controlled demolitions. That is why our issue is so important, and that's why this issue is still as relevant today as it was when the 9/11 had just happened so many years ago.
Well, you know, it's interesting because if you take the building destruction out of the equation and you simply had a whole bunch of folks getting sick in the New York area with a disease initially that wasn't easily understood and that had pulmonary problems and so on, very much like what people were finding who worked in Beckett, West Virginia, back in the 60s or late 50s and 60s, and they said, you know, we've got miners who are coming down with chronic lung disease, and when you do an autopsy, the lungs are covered with coal dust. So epidemiological studies were done to determine, yes, in fact, exposure to mines that were not well ventilated caused disease. And so the Environmental Protection Act at the time and NIOSH and the Labor Department began to initiate regulations to reduce the probability of miners getting sick. And then they introduced the Mine Workers Health Program, which is another bone of contention today under the current administration, where they're trying to cut back on that thing. And I think they just recently said that they would fund it continuously. So that if there were disease, and this is what we found in the 50s, when all of a sudden 5,000 people in the city of London died following a smog event of incredible proportions. And they said, what is causing this? And so they began to investigate the causes of the deaths during that period of time. And then we saw in Los Angeles a lot of people getting sick from the smog that people were describing. When 20 people died in West Virginia, near the Monongahela River, in a little town, what the heck was the name of that town? It was written up called The Fog, the deaths due to the fog. People began to ask the question, what are the impacts of air pollution, dust, etc., on people's health? Now, when you had the event in 9/11, and irrespective of the thing falling down and 3,000 people dying as a result of the crash, everybody saw that there was a huge air cloud of material that came out of those buildings. It would have made a lot of sense, it seems to me, for the Health Department of New York City, which is an outstanding health department, and I don't mean, as a matter of fact, the guy who was the health department director at that time, I think it was a friend of mine. I can't remember his name, but I knew a lot of these people because I was in public health. But they didn't initiate an epidemiological study to examine, and they could have done this years later, to examine the deaths of people. They keep perfect records. The vital records in New York City are excellent. If they had kept track of the deaths, which now people are now doing, to determine where were they at 9/11, if they could figure that out, from the family. What was the wind pattern at that day so that the dust was being blown by the wind and came down, people being affected? Then they would have probably been able to identify a pattern of disease early in the aughts of this current century, a pattern of disease that would have led them to realize that there were causal factors in the cloud itself that resulted in people's getting sick. And it wouldn't have had to be 10, 15, 12 years later where people began to come into the hospitals and to the medical centers in New York complaining of illnesses, and then people recognized that they were people at the exposed to ground zero. The other thing about this, which is so distressing to me, and I'm sure to other physicians and public health people and people who are aware of smog and air pollution, is that there was not a lot of effort made to protect the people at ground zero who were doing the work initially to identify if there were anybody who was living in the crash, to find people who might be injured but still alive. That was clearly important to do. But in any occupational environment, the National Institute of Occupational Safety, Health and Safety at NIOSH should be on site to determine that there are health problems and not only mandate the use of masks and breathing equipment for everybody on site, but in some cases protective suits, just as they had at Chernobyl when they went in to try to stop that problem, in Russia and in Ukraine. The thing is, we did not take the necessary precautions and safeguards to protect the people at ground zero. That was a major failure of the government at the time, and I think the criticism of Christy Whitman and so on and so forth has been made, and her recommendations were suppressed the recommendations of the EPA were suppressed by the government, by the White House. We don't know for sure, but it's important to remember that both the Environmental Protection Agency and NIOSH were established in law not to solve social problems, not to be a political oppressor of government or whatever, but to protect people's health. The major function of the Environmental Protection Act is to protect people and animals against untoward events that pollute the water, that pollute the air, that pollute the ground, and that's the rationale, that's the logic behind the Environmental Protection Act, and similarly the NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety, the purpose of NIOSH is to make sure that industrial situations, workplace situations, do not harm the health of the people who are doing the job on site. Those are health-related diseases, and someone blew it. Someone didn't say there may be health problems associated with the people here at ground zero or in lower Manhattan or under the cloud and so on, and therefore we have what we have today, and that is that there are tens of thousands of people who probably over the next decade will get sick and die. It's kind of like the smoking thing. If you don't stop people from smoking, they're going to continue to die. And these people were not stopped from breathing the air at ground zero. And that's the tragedy of the whole thing.
Now, you mentioned the giant cloud that we saw all throughout Manhattan, and this is actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, do we have any idea how far the radius of the danger area was? Like, in terms of people who have gotten sick, you may or may not have an answer to this, but the people who got sick, how far out from ground zero did they travel?
I don't have that answer. However, the New York Health Department and the people who are doing the analysis, they're mentioned in McKee's paper. The New York health people who are studying that know where the people who are coming to them with illness associated with, which seem to be associated with the event. They know where they live. They know how far away from ground zero they were, and certainly the Vital Records Department of the New York City Health Department has the place of the domicile, the place of residence of every individual who has filed a death, who have died in New York City since 2001, and they can identify, because they have not only the names, the ages of the people involved, they also have the cause of death. Now, the cause of death may be as obscure as lung disease or chronic congestive lung problems, but one could go and look at the distribution of illnesses, the cause of death of which are consistent with the illnesses that the physicians are identifying from these people who were exposed, and estimate approximately the frequency of people's dying 1 mile away, 2 miles away, 5 miles away, according to where they lived. I mean, that's what epidemiology is all about, and I would suspect that the people in New York City could do that study, and we would know what is the risk of someone who is living in Coney Island as compared to someone who is living in Flatbush or in downtown New York. Those are things that could be identified. And the other issue is that given that we now have some of the people who have picked up the dust that fell out of that cloud, we have samples of that, and clearly those samples should be completely analyzed in terms of the nature of the chemical products that are in those samples. And we know that there are iron globules, that there's magnesium, that there's aluminum. There are a variety of chemicals in the dust that was found, and that dust was being breathed by people who now are suffering the lung diseases associated with those particles. Keeping in mind that when whatever caused the explosion of those buildings, whether it was set by bad guys or by whoever, I mean, I'm not going to even begin to think about that. All we know is that the concrete that was set in the floors and the steel that was cut by whatever system to cause the buildings to collapse, whether it was thermite or thermate, I don't know the answer to that. But there is evidence of the residue of those chemicals in this dust. And the particles of that dust are at the 2.5 microgram, micro size, 2.5 millimeters in size, or micrometers, I'm sorry. These are particles that are so small that they can be breathed in and they get into the alveoli and into the lung tissue. Some of them, if they're small enough, can even be passed into the bloodstream and then picked up by the hemoglobin and carried around. And that probably is what is the locus or the cause of some of the obscure diseases that are being recognized. Now, the other thing that we know was in that building, and we know causes disease, is asbestos. And that was one of the problems that the buildings had even before the event, was that the steel was coated all the way up and down the 110 stories of both buildings. It was coated in asbestos. Now, when you blow up asbestos and make it into very fine particles, as we learned about the shipbuilders in the Second World War, when you breathe in asbestos, your chance of mesothelioma increases dramatically. And I think we're seeing cases of mesothelioma in the survivors of that event. So that these are things which should have been thought about at the time. Ground zero should have been cordoned off absolutely and no one allowed into there until somehow they had sucked out or gotten rid of the dust and the particulate matter that was associated with the collapse, and also the idea of protecting the forensic steels and other things that were in Ground Zero, which is another whole story. But clearly, deaths could have been prevented had Giuliani and his health department carried out a more aggressive analysis of the event, of the problem at hand at the time of the event.
Now, from Craig McKee's article, it says, to this day, Whitman contends that her job was to pass along to the public information from qualified scientists about the air quality at the site. But in September 2006, she apologized for the first time to those who have become ill, admitting that the information she had been given was incorrect. Now, my question is, do we have any idea who these qualified scientists are, and have you heard on what basis they gave this advice, supposedly, to Ms. Whitman.
I don't have that information. Clearly, the scientists who were doing the analysis of the air and the water and the environment were EPA employees, and they were probably highly trained and highly skilled. However, it's not inconceivable, and this happens all the way around the country. When I was the health officer in North Dakota, we would do our own analysis and then submit it to EPA if we thought there was a power plant, for example, that was polluting the air inappropriately. We would do the analysis, we'd go after that power plant, and we'd shut them down. And then we'd tell the EPA, and if there was a further problem, they would come in and help us out. So it's not inconceivable to me, and I don't know this for sure, this is just a guess, that the basic analysis that was done at Ground Zero and at the lower part of Manhattan was carried out by the New York City Health Department personnel. And believe me, the NYC Health Department is one of the most finest in the country. I don't know to what extent their environmental protection group is. The state has a very good environmental protection, so they may have called upon state investigators as well. But it is also possible, and this does happen, and I have been exposed to this kind of pressure, that in jurisdictions of that type, so if the word comes down from, say, the mayor in New York City or the governor, that we want to make sure that we can get people back to Wall Street tomorrow so we can go back to work and follow up, because we've got jobs to do and we've got business to carry out. It's not inconceivable, as, for example, what happened in Flint, Michigan this year, that scientists who work for the government can feel pressure from those under whom they work in order to diminish the level of concern about the problem that exists. We've seen that in a variety of situations. Quite frankly, I think the best example of late is the Flint, Michigan situation, where the whole state health department was essentially suppressed in their presentation of the data about lead and so on, and contaminants in the Flint water system. That does happen. Politics often can overrule public health, and unfortunately, I would not be surprised if Ms. Whitman, Secretary Whitman, got information that may have been diluted or not as accurate as it should be in putting together the memorandum that she put forward. I wouldn't be surprised either if there was pressures from her boss, or from her bosses, the White House, etc., to make the report look as benign as possible. I mean, these things do happen in politics, and that's one of the troubles that we in public health find ourselves confronted with. That's one of the reasons I say I've been fired from some of the best jobs in the country, simply because I did my job. I mean, these things do happen in politics, and whether that would be a possibility or not, I don't know. But it's conceivable that someone was playing games to suppress the horrendous nature of the gases and the particles and the air pollution and so on that was falling on New York in order to get on with the business of doing the job or whatever.
Now, I remember in December of 2001, I wasn't questioning 9/11 yet. The event had just happened back, only a couple of months before. And we were going back from Florida, where I was living at the time, to New York, but we decided to make some stops along the way. We first went to the Pentagon, and then we went to New York City. We didn't do Shanksville, but we went to Ground Zero. And I distinctly remember there was dust, like in certain areas, and people were writing messages in it. I actually got a picture of it. And
oh, really?
Yeah, actually, I've got a really good photo album. I ought to put this online at some point that I took in the aftermath of 9/11 a few months afterwards, and it's got sort of a extra touch to it because it was around Christmas, and so you see all this wreckage, but you see sort of also this Christmas atmosphere trying to live within the landscape here. And anyway, it makes me think because, a couple of months from September to December is not very long after the event took place, and so it prompts me to ask you in this discussion, how long could the toxins realistically have remained in the air after 9/11? Was it just those few days following the event when the real danger time took place, or could it have been months?
Well, it depends. This is one of those non-answerable questions exactly. For example, if there were not, I don't know what the climate was in New York City during that period. So, whether if there was rain, usually a sufficient amount of rain will wash out any particles that are floating around in the atmosphere. But if there's not a lot of rain, or if the period is dry, and if the winds are not very strong, then you can have particulate matter floating through the air for a long time. It'll settle on eaves of buildings, it'll settle on roofs of buildings, and then when the wind picks up, it'll be blown around again. There is, however, another possible situation that needs to be considered, and that is if you saw dust on the sidewalk or on the eaves of buildings and so on, at some point that dust would be washed away in a decent rainstorm, and that would then end up in the sewer system of New York. It would end up in the sewer treatment plants, and ultimately it would end up in the East River and in the Hudson River. And because the materials were probably very small, they would not settle immediately to the bottom of the water systems, but many of them probably would be consumed by the fish and by the other the mollusks and the clams and so on. So one might still find some of that material in the biological ecosystem that is extant in that area. Now, 17 years is a long time. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a fish biologist. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of the animals that were captured during that period and after that period might have, in fact, been laden with some of the dust and the materials that came out of the building.
Now, from Craig McKee's article, it says, one such victim was artist Jeanette Mckinley, whose apartment building stood very close to the World Trade Center. In 2010, McKinley died of brain cancer that appears to have been caused by her exposure to toxic ground zero environment. McKinley was well known and greatly admired within the 9/11 Truth movement, in part for having had the presence of mind to collect dust samples from the destruction of the towers. She sent those samples to Dr. Stephen Jones, one of the co-authors of the research paper, Active Thermitic Materials Discovered in Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe. Now, I have very little background in medical matters, and so there's a lot I still don't understand. And what I'm going to ask you is, typically when we think of lungs when it comes to toxins in the World Trade Center dust, that's what we hear a lot about. How does one get cancer in the brain from the dust? How does that process work?
Well, that's another question, and that's one of these very complicated issues that relates to the size of the particles that are being ingested or breathed in. Now, a certain number of those particles probably were eaten. I mean, in other words, if you happen to be going to McDonald's and you have a hamburger and the stuff is falling out of the sky and you open the hamburger and squirt on a little ketchup, you may, in fact, put a few particles onto your hamburger, or you may be eating it on your salad. So ingestion takes place in at least two distinct ways. One is through breathing, and the other is through eating. Now, in both situations, if the particles are small enough, they can be carried into the bloodstream. Particles, and we know this because we see in people who are exposed to high levels of air pollution in different communities around the country, that they have a higher incidence of certain cancers, some of them lung cancer, but other cancers, and bladder cancer, for example, and liver cancer and other things. And they are also subject to heart disease and other health problems related to the substances that are in the air and which somehow or another pass into the body and are ingested. So that if I don't know how something can cause brain cancer, and one cannot necessarily say that her brain cancer death was due to a exposure to the materials in the thing. That's one of the things that we have to be very careful about when talking about causes of death from specific events like air pollution or whatever. However, what gives you information about that, and this is the fog, for example, the thing I talked about a moment ago in West Virginia, when a power plant or a steel mill actually cleaned its scrubbers or whatever and blew a whole lot of stuff out into the environment. What's the name of that town? I can't remember. It'll come to me. Then you had 20 people die from lung problems, from breathing problems, over the course of a 24-hour period. Now, this is in a town of less than 9,000 people, and you may have one death a week or two deaths a week, and yet the coroner was going out 3 and 4 times during the first night to bring in people who have just died. So you knew that there was something toxic going on in that environment. Now, they didn't know what it was. But there was something going on. And the same was true in London in 1948, when 5,000 people died over a 2-week period, and that never happened before. We saw that in Los Angeles with the smog events of the 40s and 50s. Epidemiology will give you insight into the possible causes of death, but you cannot identify unless you know specifically, as we do with asbestos, for example. When you find asbestos, the person has been working in an asbestos factory, shipbuilding, and putting asbestos on pipes, and then they have a mesothelioma. We know that asbestos does cause mesothelioma because we've studied that over the last 50 years. So there are some illnesses. Smoking is another example. But her death, I don't know. That could be just a chance event. People do get brain cancer and die. Ted Kennedy being a classic example. But the fact that she lived in that area, was exposed to the remnants of the materials that fell out of the sky after the explosion, would give you a high incidence of suspicion. Now, did her lungs show on the pathology report? Did it show that she had invested? Did the brain tumor show materials like iron globules or aluminum or manganese or any of these other chemicals? Were they found? I don't know the answer to that.
What gets me about this is how much difficulty the first responders had in trying to get any kind of compensation for this. I mean, these were people that rushed to the scene, ultimately put their lives on the line, not knowing what to expect, just trying to find survivors, working with each other. And I had a lot of respect for those folks, the firefighters that day.
Absolutely.
So
they're heroes. Those people are heroes. I mean, and the people who came from out of state to help with that whole thing. We had, I think, the Phoenix Fire Department actually sent a contingent of their employees to the site, and those people should all be followed up to determine whether or not they were exposed to materials and are subject to potential illness. And whether or not they're being done, I don't know the answer to that.
Now, you talked about locking off the scene until the air was cleared. Now, the other side might argue, well, the first responders wanted to get into the ground zero pile to search for survivors. What is typical? I know that 9/11 was not a very typical situation, but if you have a disaster, if you have something where there's questions about the air quality, what's a typical protection for people going into the scene for first responders who ultimately had to get there and fight fires, whatever. What should have protected them that day?
Well, all you have to look at is the folks who jump off the fire engines with a major conflagration going on, and they immediately put on their breathing masks. They immediately put on their protective suits, their fire protective suits. They immediately cover their head. They wear glasses or goggles. In other words, they protect themselves. Now, does that eliminate all of the possible hazards of a burning building? No, it doesn't. That's why firemen have a higher incidence of lung disease and other problems as compared to, say, you and I. But clearly, when they're rushing into a building that's under fire, they protect themselves against the materials that might be burning in the environment. That should have been done on the ground zero situation. Every person who worked in that environment should have been protected with gloves, with a bodysuit that would protect them from materials being either ingested by mouth or coming through, and if someone got an illness, or say someone stubbed their toe, or not stubbed their toe, but cut their hand, you don't want materials coming through into the open bloodstream. So that kind of protection should have been done. Now, I wasn't there, and I don't know what the protection was, but I do remember people talking about the inadequacy of the breathing devices, the fact that there wasn't some kind of set of rules that stipulated everyone must be suited up in this way. Now, they may not have had a sufficient number of respirators and breathing equipment and so on and so forth, but they should have got them, and they should have kept people from going in. If it had been a radiation event like at Chernobyl, you know darn well that they would not have allowed people in who were not protected against the radiation level. When you have a disaster, you see that with firefighters in forest fires. If they're not protected, they can die like the folks did in Arizona a couple of years ago. They've got to have the appropriate protection, and it's the responsibility of those in charge to make sure that is the case. Now, as I say, I wasn't there. I don't know who was managing it, but I do know that Giuliani wanted to get the thing cleaned up as quickly as possible, and to some extent, I think his absence of responsibility is tantamount to some kind of criminal activity. But that's another whole story.
Well, I'm going to take this from the article again. It says, according to the research, those in the WTCHR program who were in the World Trade Center towers at the time of the event were 30% more likely to have PTSD and 50% more likely to be frequent binge drinkers 10 years after 9/11. Even workers involved in World Trade Center recovery at the Fresh Kills landfill on the barges, had an increased risk of new onset asthma, and they further illustrate why the mission of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth remains so vital. The first part of this touches upon the mental health impacts of September 11th, which I think is very important because so much of what plagues society stems from what goes on in people's brains, and PTSD.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree. That's one of the, of course, I have to admit that now you're getting above my pay grade. I'm not an expert by any means in mental health, although I've run the couple of the state health departments I ran was responsible for mental health, but that doesn't make me an expert. But we know from the experience in Iraq and to some extent in Vietnam, and certainly in the First World War and the Second World War when it was, battle fatigue and other, that the experience of being involved in a huge disaster of some kind, whether it's bombardment or a fire or just a catastrophe, a catastrophe of some kind or another, that has a very strong, significant effect on the mental health of the people involved. I mean, you talk about trauma to women who are raped, or to men who are abused by other men when they're children. these events have a major impact on your psychology. Now, what the reasons for that is, what the psychological and biological and physiological reasons are, we don't know. But it clearly has an impact. And the fact that binge drinking, that alcoholism, drug abuse, look what's happening with the drug abuse, the opioid epidemic that's now going on, these are all symptoms of a psychological set of problems that can occur from something like a 9/11. I mean, I would not have wanted to be in that building on that day because just watching what happened, even if you got out alive, if you were a fireman, for example, the chances are. I have a cousin, my sister's son, who worked in those buildings, and he got off the subway. He happened to be late because he had voted that day, I think. There was an election going on. He came in, I think it was 10:30 or something like that. He got off the subway train and started walking up, and he saw all the stuff that was going on, people running back, and he said, I'm not going in, I'm getting out of here. And he took the last subway train back to his home in Yonkers or wherever he was. And yet he still has, he still thinks, oh man, I don't know, maybe I should have gone in and done something. I mean, the effect, mental illness is the impact on your psyche is a very strong thing. And he lost friends in that situation. It's hard to categorize this stuff. I just, it's not, and we'll continue to see outcomes from that event, both physiological and psychological, for years and years and years.
So considering what you just said and everything we've talked about over this hour, I gave my comment, but I want to hear yours. To those people who say 9/11 happened, 16 years ago, we need to move on, we need to put it behind us, let's not even bother looking at it, let's not bother looking into why these buildings actually came down when they shouldn't have. What do you have to say to that attitude?
I think that people are benighted in that sense, although I know that is a common. I have good friends, engineers, people with a lot more knowledge about some of this stuff than I have, and they want to do exactly as you said. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to expose myself to the worry that it might have been something other than I'm convinced it was. Let's get on and go forward and not worry about it. I think that's wrong, because if you're not willing to analyze a problem that has occurred and determine the reasons behind it and the results of the outcome of that, then you're not doing your job as a human being, but as a professional in an environment. It would seem to me, and again, this is something I'm sure that most of us in this 9/11 truth area feel, that we need to do the analysis of the problem in greater detail than was done under the 9/11 report. That we need to determine not only the rationale behind whatever was behind the fact that people flew airplanes into those buildings and brought them down. We need to know what brought them down, what were the chemicals involved, what was the material in the building that was blown up and caused health problems, and what was it about that event that has affected and caused people to have a PTSD type of syndrome, because that's going to go on. I mean, it's like when you found people who survived the Holocaust, they did not live normal lives after that event. I talked to what's his name, Weil, these people, Eli Wiesel. On the other hand, it's that their children also are impacted, because these events have significant human impact. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us who are still stressed by that event to do what we can to get an independent prosecutor, if you will, to study the situation, give them the resources necessary. I think one should go back and read the 9/11 Toronto report, the international hearing on the events of September 11, 2001, edited by James Gorley. This is a piece of work that covers a lot of the issues we've been talking about not all the health issues, but certainly a lot of the other issues, and makes the point that if you don't have a really qualified analysis by people who are willing to sit there in judgment and willing to listen to a variety of all the factual data that you can pull into it and argue between A and B and C and D, you're not going to get an answer. The NHTSA report, for example, is baloney. Those buildings did not come down in the way they described it. We need to know more. So that's my recommendation, that we need to know more. We need to continue pressing for an investigation. If we don't do it, 50 years from now, we will not have the information. And it might occur again, or something like it might occur. You need to know something about the event in order to prevent it and future outcomes of something akin to it.
Those are great words to end it on. I just want to ask you, do you have any final thoughts, anything you want to share with the audience?
Well, I hope that you've listened to this discussion and go out and do your own research. Read David Griffin's books. Try to get hold of the Toronto report. Look up 9/11 health problems if you are medically oriented in the journals. They're there. You can pull them up. Many of the references are in Mr. McKee's article. I think that article says it as well as I could. There are facts that need to be uncovered. There are issues that need to be reviewed, and there are causes of disease that we need to learn and study and do things to prevent for the future and learn how to handle the problems of people who got sick as a result. That all has to be done, and everyone who is involved and who's listening to this station should be trying to do something to get that information out. Write your congressman, write your senator. Say, I want to know more about this problem.
Dr. Jonathan Weisbuch, thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Well, I hope I've been helpful, Andy. I appreciate the opportunity to give you this information. Thanks a lot.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week. Good luck.